just launched recently, but maybe before jumping into kind of the actual assessment, is to just go through, just some slides on what an assessment is. So, we all read assessments, we all part of assessments, we probably do assessments all the time without knowing that that's what we're doing. But essentially, for the purpose of a lot of the assessments that take place here, they a two-way process, and they're co-created within a policy environment. So they're not just a bunch of researchers that say, hey, we want to write about these things. They come with very clear policy needs and a whole scoping report that's negotiated through quite a political process to set up a scope of work for what the assessment needs to cover. They're also not a new research projects, so we don't kind of create new information. We synthesize existing information that has already been produced in a number of different ways. We evaluate it, summarize it, and synthesize it in a way so that it can inform policy. And so, a lot of the assessments don't strive to give a single answer to some of the complex questions, but they show a range of different options and a range of different knowledge to try and answer some of the questions. With this assessment specifically, they also are part of a very large process, which needs to be transparent, it needs to be deliberative, and have a whole suite of kind of governance mechanisms attached to it, either, from the way that they assign experts to the assessment, how the review process happens. And they really have tried throughout the years of IPBES to try and get a diverse range of disciplines that are involved, really try and include many different types of epistemologies and also different types of knowledge systems. So it's not just on peer-reviewed kind of published literature, but a wide range of kind of ways of knowing about the world. And so essentially an assessment is a social process designed to bring the findings of science to bear on the needs of decision makers. And we're probably aware of quite a few that exist. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was one of the first more environmental ones. The global environmental outlooks have also been happening for a number of years. We all know about the IPCC, which is really focusing on climate change. And they're all within a process that is trying to kind of be legitimate, credible, and salient, which is basically to focus on end user needs. But what is different about IPBES, which stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it's essentially the IPCC-like mechanism for biodiversity, and it has a range of different functions. So the one function is around assessing knowledge, which is where the assessment processes happen, but it also has a whole lot of other things that it does. So it builds capacity for conducting assessments and also for building new knowledge on biodiversity and ecosystem services, strengthens the knowledge foundation. So not just looking at peer-reviewed literature, but also really trying to engage with all other types of knowledge and information, with a strong emphasis on how to bring Indigenous and local knowledge into the assessment process. Supporting policy processes, how we communicate the information that comes from these assessments, which are these massive big reports at the end, and how can we synthesize that into ways that can engage the broader public. And then also a whole lot of activities around improving the effectiveness of the platform. So it was, I think, first spoken about in 2010 and then formally established in 2012. And I don't know how many governments have signed up for it, but there are quite a few. So it's not a UN body, but it's aligned to a whole lot of different UN processes. And so just for an example, they're quite big processes. So, for example, the global assessments, which Odie worked on, took about 3 years. There were 6 chapters, about 1,800 pages, one summary for policymakers, tens of thousands of publications that were reviewed, lots and lots of comments. So it's quite a big undertaking, each assessment. One of the really nice things about it is the fellowship program that they have. So part of the capacity building, it's not only for decision makers to understand some of the science and synthesis work, but also trying to engage with emerging and early career researchers. And that's how we got involved in IPBES. So we were both fellows I was in the Africa assessment, Odie was in the global assessment. And it's an amazing way to meet a whole load of researchers from around the world. So if a call comes out for another assessment, it's definitely something that you might want to get excited about. And then, as I said, it's got a whole kind of mechanism around it. So, through a secretariat that holds kind of IPBES, but then also holds some of the assessments. The assessment process happens in these expert groups and task forces. They've got all of these management systems with observers, different stakeholders, ways that you can engage, review, download, make comments. And those normally happen in plenary processes. So once an assessment has been completed, and it's normally confidential for the 2.5 years while it's being done, and then it gets put out to all of the countries that have signed up, and the interested stakeholders that have signed up sit in these massive rooms, comb through word by word, so similar to the IPCC process, and at the end, hopefully it is approved and everyone is really excited and you get to talk about it, which is really great. And that's where we are now in that process of, so the plenary happened 2 weeks ago at the same time as the assessment on sustainable use, which is also a really interesting assessment. But I was involved in, well, we're both, earlier myself, were involved in the values assessment in the futures chapter, so kind of the forward-looking chapter, which I'll speak a bit more about. So just the context of why this assessment happened. So there were a few other IPBES assessments before this, but one of the main ones that you might have heard about and read the findings from was the global assessment. There were regional assessments before that. And essentially, you know, it painted quite a bleak picture in terms of where we are around the state of ecosystems, biodiversity, lots of declines in many different systems due to a number of different drivers. And there's huge evidence base behind it, which is really useful and you can dig into it. But what was really interesting to see is if you just look at the far side in terms of what drives the drivers, are whole sets of values and behaviors. And so it was really important to also dig into understanding a bit more about both values and how values play out in decisions around nature, also what the different types of values of nature are, and also how do you value nature. So in lots of different ways, nature has been valued for economic terms, but how do we go beyond that and what are the different options that we can have? So I think the global assessment and other assessments, climate change assessments, are also highlighting the need that we really need to change things, the way that we live, the way that we consume, the way that we relate to each other and to the environment. And all of them are pointing towards these big transformative changes that need to happen. And most of those are underpinned by value systems. So that was, this is kind of one of the and I'm only going to touch on the high level findings. There's lots of detail behind all of these. But decisions based on a narrow set of market values of nature underpin the current biodiversity crisis. So that's one of the main messages that came from this. But there are many opportunities to embed diverse values of nature into decision making for navigating for just and sustainable futures. And I think one of the great things about this, the values assessment, is it really moved beyond just talking about sustainability, and justice was embedded firmly within the whole assessment, which is really great. So it wasn't just saying like, how can we continue using resources, but how can we make sure that that use is more equitable going into the future and that everyone can benefit from it. So like all assessments, there's a big team behind it and a whole process. So we had 3 author meetings, 2 in person, 1 online. So a lot of this assessment was done online, a whole review process, and this was all happening during COVID, so which made it very challenging. They also ran lots of engagements with different knowledge holders, and they had a special liaison group and a whole set of dialogues and calls that tried to look for other ways of understanding how people value nature, what different values for nature exist in the world that aren't based on kind of peer-reviewed literature. Again, based on a huge amount of evidence, and this is one of the most important things, because when you're synthesizing it, you also have to say how confident you are, and that's based on how much evidence there is. And that's really key for decision makers, because that helps them, hopefully helps them make decisions if there's a whole lot of evidence behind it. So yeah, it's all voluntary. So it's people, kind of committing to this process, a whole range of different people. You have to be nominated normally by your government or by another institution. And mostly if your government hasn't signed up to be part of IPBES, then your university or another body could nominate you, and then there's a whole selection process. So they try to make sure that there are lots of different disciplines, all like geographically. It's also, there's a big spread And I think they did a pretty great job with the values assessment. And again, an amazing set of people to learn from and work with over the last couple of years. So the relevance of this report, and I kind of mentioned that in some of the findings of the global assessment, but what came out very clearly is economic and political decisions have predominantly prioritized market-based instrumental values of nature. And many of nature's values are often ignored in favor of short-term profits for economic growth. And none of this is new. We can see it playing out around us, but now there's a whole report that can document some of the evidence behind it. And conservation policies also risk downplaying the values of local communities that depend on nature for their livelihoods. And ignoring, excluding, or marginalizing local values often leads to various different conflicts linked to value clashes, especially in the context of power asymmetries, and these undermine the effectiveness of environmental policies. So if you're not bringing values to the table and negotiating them in open processes, there's a high likelihood that a lot of the decisions are going to fall flat or be challenged or have extreme implications for certain population groups. What the assessment also found is achieving sustainable and just futures requires this recognition and integration of diverse values of nature into political and economic decisions, and recognizing the values of local people affected by decisions results in better outcomes for people and nature. And again, none of this is like new, but it was really great to be able to have a whole body of evidence that supports a lot of these key findings. What the assessment also did is it worked with these different typologies of nature. So obviously people value nature in different ways depending on who you are, your knowledge systems, language, cultures, and the context which you live in. So they came up with these life frames, which are kind of living as, living with, living in, and living from nature. And these are the different typologies that they then use to explore, what would indicators for those different value types be, what are specific values. And so the next one kind of digs down and goes a couple of layers below. And so within this values typology, there's also different ways that people see the world and interact with the world, which can be more anthropocentric or more kind of pluricentric, or depending on your cosmology and what you believe in. There are many different ways, and there's a whole spectrum of ways that people relate to nature, and again different knowledge systems as well that are involved in that. Different people have different ways to think about what a good life might be like, and have differential judgments regarding the importance of nature in particular situations. So some values of nature are more instrumental, and so the definition used here was to as nature as a means to an end. So nature is a resource or an asset to satisfy the needs and preferences of people. Other people see it as intrinsic, so which is the agency of it's other than humans, so it's the kind of more inherent value of biodiversity and nature for people. And then also relational ways, so importance of desirable, meaningful, and often reciprocal human relationships. And so digging through a whole lot of different literature, they were able to kind of create these typologies in different ways that people might relate to nature. And obviously it can be a combination of those. So you're not just one, you don't relate to nature in one thing. So like food as an example can be all of those. So it's very useful for us to eat. It's also linked to cultural practices. It's also how we relate to other people in the world, and it contributes greatly to kind of human well-being. And they also outline some of these different ways that you can, the value indicators, which are some are biophysical, some are monetary based, and some are sociocultural. And so this is quite a nice way to show and also use this as a typology then to look at the different valuation tools that people might use to include nature in various decision-making processes. So the assessment found that there's no shortage of methods and approaches to value nature, but their uptake in decisions remains limited. And they found that less than 5% of published valuation studies report any uptake in policy decisions. Even though we're still using a lot of economic ways to value nature, that's not even included in decision-making processes. And going into a bit more detail, they also characterized yeah, all of these different studies into, what method family they come from, how they relate to those life frames that I mentioned, living as, living in, living with, living from, the goals of the valuation, whether it's improving kind of a quality of life, improving the status of nature, which you can see is what most of the studies did, a very tiny little slice of 4% that were improving justice outcomes. Looking at the specific values of nature, whether they kind of instrumental, relational, intrinsic, and you can see most of them are instrumental. Nature does things for us, and so we value it. Yeah, where these valuation studies were applied. So most of them are applied at subnational levels. And then also looking at the different indicators. And just given the history of a lot of the work on biodiversity and ecosystems, most of it is biophysical types of indicators that people would use. Just the little rainbow at the bottom shows the habitats where these studies were applied. And I think what's really interesting for me is you can't really see it, but the second, the lightest purple band is urban. And if we look at population trends around urbanization and where most of the people are going to live, it's really important to start doing a lot of work in the urban space to value and understand how people, even in urban settings, value nature and how the values of nature can be included in decision-making processes. So this was the chapter that we worked on, which was looking at of all of the different scenarios that are out there that use some type of valuation of nature or values of nature. What do they tell us about the future? And so transformative change needed to address the global biodiversity crisis relies on shifting away from values that overemphasize short-term and individual material gains to more sustainability-aligned values across society. And there were very clear kind of relationships with the more sustainability aligned futures definitely had certain values attached to them. And if we want, the business as usual is not going to get us there, which is focusing more on instrumental values. And there are a number of different strategies that people have used, like earth stewardship, degrowth, nature protection, green economy, that can get us to more just and sustainable futures. But a lot of them need a couple of tweaks along the way. And what the assessment also did is it highlighted how different tools for adding valuation to those processes can strengthen them to either add in elements of sustainability or of justice. And so that was quite a cool chapter to work on, but also quite hard to bring in. So it was, you can do a systematic review for peer-reviewed literature, but how do you start bringing in and weighing up and synthesizing information that comes from ILK dialogues, and how do you weave that into the confidence claims that you push to develop for these types of assessments. And so we also in this looked at a whole set of arts-based practices. So there were people that were looking at actual artworks and seeing how they depicted the future and values of nature into the future. And also looked at arts-based practices as methods to try and think about a range of different human nature futures. So that's very cool to be part of. The next chapter kind of really focused on, okay, so we know this, and we know that all of these changes are happening. We know that values aren't included in decision making. What can we do? And so they used, similar to the global assessment, where they use this notion of leverage points. So where can you intervene in a system in order to make these changes? And these leverage points move from kind of shallower leverage points, which work more at kind of addressing some of the symptoms of the problems, to these deeper leverage points where you actually need these like structural changes in the norms and the goals and the values of people. And so it kind of created this typology and these different leverage points. And then they also use that to think about how do you engage with different stakeholder and actor groups in order to leverage these changes. And specifically with this assessment, how do you recognize the values of nature? How do you use different tools to value nature and include it in decision-making processes? And then the harder stuff around how do you actually kind of mobilize these more sustainability-aligned values and shift these big development paradigms that exist in the world that are focused more on kind of growth, and more growth. And it was really interesting in when this was negotiated, what were the sticking points and the sticking terms, and what did people feel, like they didn't want to let go of. And so I think some of the language through the review process had to be changed to make it more palatable to some decision makers. Some people felt like it was being completely watered down. Other people felt like we were already being a bit too strong on certain terms, which it came out very clearly that kind of the capitalist system that we all live and enjoy is causing a lot of the decline. And it was interesting that people didn't necessarily have a problem with that framing, but other things, terms, were a bit more problematic. What the assessment also did is it looked at, these different steps on how you can, and through these iterative steps, how you can start building different ways of how to account for values in decision-making context that balance kind of the resources you have, how robust the process might be or the information is, and how relevant it is to various decision-making processes. Came up with these different steps of how to actually use some of the tools that are highlighted in the assessment and summarized quite nicely in some tables, to change the business as usual that's not getting us to where we want to be. And more specifically within, these different policy cycles, so whether you're kind of at the agenda setting stage, you're formulating the policy, the policy's being adopted, you're implementing it or evaluating it, at each of those different levels, there are points where you can add valuation process or valuation tools, to kind of broaden the types of values that are included, and because normally, it's quite a small set of values that get included in those processes. There are a whole lot of different evaluation purposes and examples for, whether you want to inform processes, to decide on things, or to design new processes. And some examples were given for each of those different things. So part of it is also around capacity building and working with a range of different stakeholders. And I think what they recognized is that normally, we do a summary for policymakers, and the idea is that policies will change the world. But I think they realized very quickly that we also need to summarize this information for a range of different stakeholders, not just because a lot of the heavy lifting happens in other spaces. So through this kind of whole spectrum of stakeholders, how do we build capacities and communicate our information in new and different ways? So some of the expected impacts for the assessment, obviously, this is part of a whole range of different assessments, and really useful for future assessments for how they can include diversity of values and valuation tools in their processes. So there are a whole lot of other assessments that have just started. One of them is the Biodiversity Food Water Health Nexus assessment.
Climate the space.
And climate that has been added to that. And we're both involved in that assessment that's just started. There's the Transformative Change assessment, which UNCI is involved in. And they are going to launch the Biodiversity in Business soon. But this values assessment can obviously contribute to all of those. They also, what's happening now is the new agenda, a new vision for biodiversity is being developed, and that's going to come out at the end of this year. That's the new global biodiversity framework. Because the Aichi targets have kind of expired, we didn't reach any of them. And I think we've reached a couple. There were maybe protected areas that we did quite well in, but it's another, in terms of linking up with the SDGs, it's kind of trying to expand on the nature-based components of achieving those sustainable development goals, given so many people rely on nature for their well-being. And the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So really useful for those different processes, especially for expanding the way that we speak about nature and making sure that it's not just because it's useful for us. And especially what was really interesting and what the assessment and the Secretariat worked really hard on is to try and make sure that they're engaging with these diverse stakeholders. So to synthesize the information in ways that, activists, Indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, everyone can use the information to kind of yeah, in ways that further the aims of those movements as well. And I think that's, yeah, it's just adding the evidence base behind what a lot of people kind of know, but now it's, yeah, hopefully provides some examples of people that people can use when they're trying to, yeah, negotiate different ways that decisions can roll out. So, yeah, maybe just a little bit on the Nexus assessment. So it's a thematic assessment. IFS also has different, they have methodological assessments that look at different tools, and the values assessment was that. The thematic assessments look at different themes. So there's been the pollination assessment, the land degradation assessment, and now this Nexus assessment. And as Odie rightly said, it's biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate. It was hard. Normally the WEF Nexus is spoken about with energy, but that was politically chucked out, but there's an inroad through climate, so it can stay in. And yeah, so that's kind of what it looks at. So Odie's working on chapter 3, which is the forward-looking futures chapter. I'm working on chapter 4. Sorry, the acronyms are coordinating lead authors. And chapter 4 looks at the different response options for trying to think about how to catalyze change. So obviously a lot of overlap with the transformative change assessment, which has also just been launched, and that's looking at underlying causes of biodiversity loss, determinants of transformative change, and options for achieving that 2020-50 vision for biodiversity. And so lots of hard work that's happening now to make sure that that vision includes a lot of the findings from previous IFS assessments and other assessments that have been happening, so linked to climate change. And I think there was a big workshop between the IPCC and IFS to try and see how they could work together and not have these two standalone assessments, but actually, you know, strong links between climate change and biodiversity conservation. And that's kind of it. But yeah, maybe to say there are lots of ways to get involved in IFS assessments. So either formally as, you know, an expert, you can also, the minute they're out for external review, that gets advertised, you can download, and anyone can do a review of the assessment and make comments on it. They have stakeholder days, they have, a call will go out in the next assessment for fellows. If any of these topics are really interesting, you can become a contributing author to some of the assessments, or you can, just carry on writing your papers that, you know, are used as an evidence base in these assessments. And so sometimes it doesn't feel like, you know, you're just doing this work and releasing it out there. But it's quite amazing when, you know, you see maybe one of your papers come up in an assessment like this and you're like, oh my God, I'm a data point. And especially, you know, working on the issues that we all work on are really important, because in all of the assessments you've seen there are big gaps in terms of kind of geography. So not as many studies coming out of the global South Africa in terms of African researchers, you know, well represented comparatively, but still not enough. Understanding transboundary issues, understanding other, or at least bringing in other disciplinary kind of knowledge bases into these assessments. So that's the values assessment. See you in 3 years for the next assessment.
Thank you so much.
Just to say, like, there are some other slides that have got some cool images. I've shown some of these, but like there's a whole lot of detail that's been summarized if you want actual examples. So if you're using a method or a tool in your study, you can go here and there's already a whole, you know, documentation of different examples, boxes that explain things, you know, the level of confidence and the relevance of some of these tools. So I mean, it's a lot in this assessment. But I think it's pretty cool.
No, that's great. And maybe to jump onto that, Nadia, there is a website dedicated to this. So I'll post the link in the chat, so to encourage everyone to go and check it out and to go into the detail, because clearly there's quite a bit.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So thank you. Thanks, Nadia. And I'll open it up to any questions. If there's anyone online with a question, feel free to put up your hand. And there we go. Micah, please feel free to unmute and raise a question in plenary.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I have a few questions. The first one is a little bit more, I guess, well, no, before I even start with a question, I want to say thank you for that overview, because I haven't actually read the details of the report. So maybe some of my questions are like, Micah, just read the report and it'll be obvious. But so just in terms of the framing of the framing that the IPBES assessments have been using, which is around the nature's contributions to people. So I saw in a lot of the figures you showed that wasn't specifically mentioned as far as I could see in terms of the values and the life frames and stuff. So what is the nexus there? How did you guys think about that?
Yeah. So in terms of, so just broadly, so IPBES and or the field of ecosystem services has also gone through a transformation where it used to be called ecosystem services, but that's there was a lot of pushback in that framing because it took more of an instrumental view of nature. It's a service for us, and so there was a reframing a couple of years ago which looked at nature's benefits to people. And then they still said, well, it's only showing benefits, but actually nature provides the services as well. So it can be very harmful to people, and especially if you speak to a lot of people that live in and near nature, it definitely is not easy. And so they changed it to nature's contributions to people. And there's a whole way that they've categorized that. And so, Micah, that was still very much part of the assessment. So when people, it maybe wasn't summarized in some of the figures that I showed, but for each of the different regions and each of the different valuation tools, they would then show if it was a specific non-material or material value, that was pulled out as well. And some other valuation tools are obviously more useful for understanding, food, water quantity, water quality, things like that. So it was very much a language, a criteria that was involved in the assessment. But I think they also wanted to make sure that the way, focus more on kind of the instrumental, intrinsic, and relational components that then cut across some of those contributions. And yeah, it was a little bit tricky at times because some people don't like nature to be called anything and put in boxes. There was also the Nature Futures Framework, which then has 3 categories. And I think this, what was really interesting in that process is, and even when they started changing what ecosystem services are called, that's like an academic argument that was playing out in a policy space, and decision makers were like, look, we don't care what you call it. Like, we just need to know how do we make decisions around, water provision and things like that. And so I think that it is always with these assessments, sometimes the researchers get carried away with their intellectual kind of activities and the kind of core messages and how you communicate really important things for decision makers gets sometimes left behind. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you so much. I'll definitely dig into that a bit. That would be an interesting kind of table to look at, I'm sure, or figure for me personally. But the other question I had was a little bit more broad. Can I ask another question? Is it okay?
Yes, go for it, Micah.
I'm looking at you. Okay, good. Thanks, Marian. So more broadly around this idea of values linking to action. So I, as you know, I've been involved in a project that's looking at sort of like behavioral economics games, and we've been playing them with students, and like what do people's behaviors change if they know, for example, that they are, managing a limited resource in a group that exhibits high levels of inequality of some sort, those kinds of questions. And just generally, I know that there's a ton of literature out there about how values do not necessarily result in certain behaviors or behavior changes. And so and you, obviously this is very much focused on decision makers, and what you were just saying of decision makers just being like, just tell us what we need to kind of do. And I think that that's obviously, then you're preaching to the choir a little bit, because they're like, okay, we just need the scientific information that tells us, how certain can we be about certain, this action having an effect or whatever. But like more generally, especially when you're talking about taking this assessment and that it having an impact more broadly in public, we know that values matter almost very little when people are in certain contexts of scarcity and trade-offs and conflicting needs, etc. especially within the capitalist system. So how did you guys have conversations around that, around how actually it's fine and good to talk about values and incorporate values, but in the end, how much does that change how people behave? And specifically, not just the decision makers, but like your average Joe.
Yeah, I think that or maybe you can also, Odie, I'm looking at Odie because that some of that was also brought in the global assessment where they, you know, when you're looking at the impacts of behaviors, you're normally looking at the outcomes for nature because that's what, you know, is being measured. What we discussed a lot in the assessment was focused on valuation. So what are the diverse ways that you can value nature that move away from just economic valuation? It was also looking at the values of nature, these different intrinsic, instrumental, but what came out very clearly is these other values that aren't necessarily linked to those that actually have more of an effect. And for that, there's not that much. So this was all looking at existing information. And so I think what's advancements that have been made that we know some people are working on is looking at those other types of values and being able to pull those through. And it's probably similar to what you're doing in your project now. And how those impact the outcomes for people and nature. And so it was something that, yeah, the assessment definitely looked at, and it interrogated it in terms of the different tools and what the assumptions are in those valuation methods. Yeah, but it wasn't, in terms of those high level messages, they really wanted to try and at least start opening up the possibility for bringing in diverse values around a table, and especially making, you know, trying to stress that if you don't do that, there are people that will not benefit, and it's normally the same people that haven't benefited. So it was really trying to highlight some of the aspects related to inequality as well. If you're not talking about plural values, economic decisions will always be kind of made that favor how useful nature is for it.
But one thing to add, Mike, I think to the point about values getting out of the window in times of scarcity, I mean, it's more prioritizing in a way, because it's not only in scarcity. So we as scientists know the impacts of flying around the world. We still do. It's not scarcity in that sense, and we still have the information, but we're not acting on it. So I think in a lot of ways, people you work with behavioral economics would talk about nudging as a I think somebody won a Nobel Prize about that recently, as a mechanism that information alone is not enough for people to act on something. So I think it's almost like a psychological process to get that process. But first you need the information. I think information is just one part of that, to me at least, I think. But I think there's a whole bunch of other work that goes with changing behavior. I don't know if, doesn't answer your question, but I was just like saying that it's not only a scarcity issue, I think, because you see it in other contexts where there's no scarcity.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's all about trade-offs, right? But it's thanks for that. I think it's I mean, obviously an ongoing, interesting conversation. So I don't want to hog too much of the time. Thanks for those reflections, guys, and really great to see this out now. Finally, I can cite it.
Thanks, Micah. There's a couple of questions online. So from Megan, Wensi, and then Willem.
Hi. It was super to listen to that. I was thinking about it from the perspective of a theme of how to talk about values of nature in our modules, for example, and from a teaching point of view. And the reference point that I have for this discussion is from the work that Johan Hatting has done around environmental ethics and thinking about ethics as a way into a conversation about values. So I was looking at a lot of those resources and wondering how do we link those conversations? Because in some ways it's the same conversation, how we value, what are our ethics in the way that we relate to nature. And was the scoping literature maybe touching on that more philosophical literature? And is there a way for us to do that in the way that we make use of these really interesting frameworks? Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. Definitely. I mean, this is something that we will be talking about next week in the biodiversity and ecosystem services module. And so there were a lot of philosophers, a lot of, I think there was one or two theologians, that's what you call it. So lots of different people that brought in kind of ethics into the assessment. Really struggled with the assessment process because it's also the way that it's designed is not necessarily easy to surface some of those. You know, at the end of the day, the assessment is synthesized in these kind of like high-level messages, and even the way in which, you know, some of the writing and the evidence exists in those spaces is not easy to bring into those processes. So there were lots of debates and lively debates, and you know, why are we even talking about green growth? That's completely fundamentally at odds with a lot of the beliefs of people. So you know, the process in itself, and I think there are sociologists and all sorts of people that are studying the process as well of how these negotiations happen, which is, yeah, I'm sure they'll be writing about it a lot. But definitely it's like ethics was core, I think, it maybe didn't come out in those messages, but it was a very strong normative stance that the assessment also took. It was saying that, yeah, there are certain ways that people live that are not good for kind of the stewardship of resources and people that benefit from those resources. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
Nadia.
you.
Megan, Wincy, you had your hand up.
Thanks so much, Nadia, for that great overview. Yeah, maybe I also just sort of on the side, I think this issue around the process, I think, is also quite interesting because it is quite a particular way of working, and I think actually Rika was also initially involved in the values assessment, but ended up withdrawing also just because of I think also the dynamics and the hours of work late at night and so on. So I mean, that is kind of interesting, you know, who maybe also gets excluded in these processes because there's a certain culture and a way that these discussions are being had. But I must say, overall, I've also been impressed with IPBES on just how widely they're trying to reach and who they're bringing into these processes, which does feel like it's increasingly wide. But my question is probably actually more like I should go and read your chapter. But I really liked your figure, and I guess also now being in the transformative change assessment, it felt like, whoa, that figure looks quite interesting. So I guess I just been wondering if there were any additional kind of 2 or 3 key points from your chapter that you felt were interesting, especially around like the focus of the CST and a lot of our work around sustainability transformations and some of the debates we're having, if there was anything that sort of particularly stood out to you that is interesting to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, heaps. So it was, it did seem a bit, I think very quickly the values assessment moved into the transformative change space. And it might have been because of the people that were involved and that's their focus. But it just felt like that was the language that very quickly came into our chapter, really, especially if we're talking about kind of future looking things. And it was already in the global assessment. And what our chapter did, which didn't come out, maybe, I think there were like 2, that's the heartbreaking thing, is that you work very hard on this. And at the end of the day, your 20 pages is a 1 sentence. And you're kind of like, oh, okay. Or if it even makes it into that. And so I think it is very hard for, you know, the process is fraught with all sorts of problems and power hierarchies and egos. And if you've got time for days, which is also, I think you mentioned it in the beginning, like this is all volunteered time. And most of the people that get involved are in secure positions and can dedicate all their time to this. And so if you've got time to do it, you can, to some degree, steer the narrative and add information that, you know, you maybe feel passionate about. It does go through a review process, but there are opportunities to game the system for sure. But in terms of the relevance to CST, I think for thinking about how change happens and how change happens, what that type of change might be for whom, I think there was quite a lot in there. I really liked the way that they started grappling with how you bring evidence in. And I see there was a comment, I think also from Nina, about the esoteric nature. I didn't think the values assessment was ever going to be approved, because I thought that this is something that is just going to be brushed over by decision makers. But actually, I mean, everybody, it's quite intuitive in some ways, because people use their value systems to make decisions. And so I think it was quite welcomed, and especially from a lot of researchers in the Global South who never see their worldviews, their ways of knowing in these big science policy processes. I think that was refreshing for them to have the explicit intention to include Indigenous and local knowledge as an evidence base, but then also engaging with Indigenous and local communities as part of the review process, I think was quite unique, and it's something that, you know, other assessments haven't done. So that was quite nice. So process-wise, methodologically, you know, I think it's also interesting for work that we do at the CST in terms of transdisciplinary research, and then communicating. How do we communicate this outwards, and thinking about not just in the policy space, but to a broad range of stakeholders. So it's still in early days, but I think I think for the transformative change assessment, there'll be lots of stuff that's useful for our Nexus assessment. It's also useful in terms of some of the methods and tools that came out of this. So I think for students looking to work around values of nature or valuation of nature, I think this is kind of a place that they can go to try and see whether there are some tools that might be able to surface things in different ways.
Thanks, Unsi and Nadia. Willem, you had a question, and then Mark online.
So it's more about the temporal aspect of it. So I know you're using existing literature, but was there any reference of how these values, norms, or belief have changed over time, and potentially what drives those different changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the job for the transformative changes that can document. So I think not in this assessment. So it was very much on that they have cutoff times. So they're like, you look at literature here. In looking at the visions, you can see how, you know, because a lot of them are like a vision for 2050, a vision for 2063, a vision for that. And there they try and speculate what those visions for nature might be under different assumptions. And so that's the scenario component, or the futures component, that then says, if we value nature, you know, in these certain ways, we can expect that maybe these things will shape. But I think the really tricky thing about a lot of this work is there are a lot of assumptions that if we do this, then these things will happen, but not a lot of evidence that backtracks and says, like, these great things have happened, and we look back and we say it was because of these interventions. And in some ways, yeah, that's the difficulty of working in the space, is that we think and we believe and we hope that acting in other ways will have different outcomes. And so at least within the futuring chapters that we've worked with, it's kind of that, like, looking into the future and then thinking about what the assumptions are today to try and bend those curves in directions that we normatively think are good.
One thing we did to add is also that by expanding what they consider to be evidence, you can start considering other things that we would normally. So in the scientific literature, at least that we will read, you'll have a lot. The future will mostly be dominated by models. But once you expand that, you can start looking into science fiction.
Yeah.
Like once you bring the arts and things, and then the imagination of what the future could be is also different, and then that carries different values in them. And I mean, in some ways, you can say some things that are now were also inspired by those kind of ways of thinking in the past about how the future will look like. That people are just freely imagining without a model that is predicting or projecting into the future. So I think more and more as mechanisms to include that kind of information becomes available, I think it'll start growing from all sorts of different visions as well that are not traditionally just an article in a journal. But anyways.
Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting to catch up on an area of work that I'm I don't know at all. I just a question, given the point being made that you moved into the transformative space, or this work has moved, to what extent is, and I'm interested in what that means for theories of change. To what extent is IPBase working with the DPSIR framework, if at all, as a particular theory of change, which is prominent in the environmental sector, and it's used in the International Resource Panel, and I'm writing a critique of it, but I'm just interested in whether it's used.
So I can speak about in the global assessment. So the different, obviously the different chapters for each of these. So one of the chapters, chapter 2, which was focusing specifically on drivers, was a chapter entirely dedicated to drivers. Used a DIPSA model as a way to think about the state of the variables that they were looking at and how the drivers are acting on those, as well as, I can't remember what the other different components of DIPSA are, but it was used very much in that chapter to frame the relations between drivers and the state of the impacts, or what sort of the impact the drivers are having on the variables of interest, as well as the what is it, state?
It's driver, pressure, state, impact, response.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what pressures and impacts are resulting from the drivers on the variables of interest?
Yeah.
So it's used as one of the ways to think about relationships, especially between drivers.
And it's in the global assessment.
Yeah. Yeah, in chapter 2 of the global assessment.
So,
okay.
And it isn't like, if you look at the IPBES conceptual framework, it is built into that, and it does follow, that kind of framing. But especially now in the Nexus assessment, that no longer, we are trying, at least the assessment is trying to look at it in a much more integrated way of how these issues are interrelated, play out at different scales, influence each other in interesting ways, and then what the outcomes are and how those outcomes then might feed back into the system. I think they've, at least in my experience with a lot of IPBES conversations, is, there's a pushback against the DIPSA framework, but then there's no example of what could be presented, or like at least contain certain sections in a way that you got everything all at the same time. And so there's a discomfort, but also, I think there's not an easy way to present some of it. Given some of the stakeholders that are involved in the assessment, which are looking at indicators of nature over time, so the IECNs, all of the different footprinting mechanisms that do follow that type of framework. So, but I think it's welcome. I think there are lots of people that are, and in some of the case studies or text boxes, and especially at least in the assessments that I've been involved in, a more social ecological based understanding of the relationship between humans and nature, and especially for the values assessment, that is what people understand kind of the relationship to be like.
Unti, I don't know if you want to respond to that conversation, because otherwise we have a comment from Nina in the chat that we can go to first, and then we can end with your question.
Yeah, I think do that. I think Odi and Nadia have said a lot on that response.
So it's just Nina says she hopes a nature values framework catalyzes an examination of the role of values across other inquiries, disciplines, and sectors, and how we influence and motivate for policies and pathways we want to shift. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know you did touch on her question a little bit earlier.
Yeah. No, and I think, this is just one way, or like a summary of what exists out there in terms of how people speak about human nature relationships and how those are valued. But there's definitely a desire, and at least in some of the assessments now, trying to look at sector responses and how values in those sectors may be shaped and are shaped by certain dynamics that exist. And it's, I think it's also how we take those conversations into the spaces where we work. And the great thing now is that there's an evidence base and examples and worked examples of how they've pulled it maybe across a couple of different domains. So both through kind of human nature values, but also valuation, and examples of a non kind of business as usual approach. So we don't have to fall back on the normal tools that we have. And it's actually not just one tool. There's not one tool that can do everything, but it's a combination of them for a specific purpose. And I think, yeah, just giving more, yeah, making it a bit more open for lots of people to be able to access some of these things, because I think IFES has sometimes remained as the science process and not necessarily as more of a democratic process. But the nature of how things are evolving in that space, there's a huge range of people that are now involved that, you know, were never involved 10 years ago, which is really cool.
If there aren't any questions, any other further questions from online, in person? Then yes, Lindsay.
It's not really a question, but yeah, I mean, I think it's just sort of a reflection is that I'm also, yeah, I think quite amazed in the sense of having been involved in the Millennium Assessment, which was now more than like 20 years ago, I think, which is a long time, but still in other ways, it's also not so long, that I think just kind of the shift that's been happening in these processes. And I mean, I think especially in the last 10 years, I think with IFES, like where it started being quite, you know, on biodiversity and ecosystem services, I feel like the shift to the kinds of things we are addressing now, especially these latest two assessments, yeah, it feels quite far removed from biodiversity and ecosystem service experts. And I think even you can feel that discomfort even in those processes where I think, you know, there are some more traditional kind of biodiversity people in these chapters, and that the topics that are being addressed now and the focus of these assessments is like quite far out of the range of, I think, the expertise or the background of some of the people involved. But I think in another sense, I think, you know, that's also to see this very much as this kind of wider engagement, capacity building, I don't know, spreading kind of different thinking process, because I think people are now immersed in these processes where they're dealing with like, yeah, very diverse kind of sets of expertise and knowledge. And I think everyone really learns from being in those processes, which is, I think, even though I was exhausted after the Africa assessment and thought I'm going to sit out for a while, now I'm back. But I think it is quite taxing, but it's also really a fun process. I think you really learn and connect with a lot of different people. But yeah, I think overall, just also linking to Mark's question about the DIPSA framework, for me, I feel like it's moved quite far. The core thinking is quite far beyond this kind of quite linear ways of thinking, even though obviously there are diverse people involved and some people are more there. But I feel like the overall framing is much more complex and relational and kind of more in the space that we're in, which I think is also reflected by the fact that a lot of like people from our kind of space and community are also really engaged and taking leadership roles in these assessments now. So I think it's actually quite exciting and yeah, kind of interesting where the space is going. And yeah, the topics and the focus of what's being addressed in this biodiversity assessment now is quite far beyond biodiversity.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think that was a really nice wrap up of the session. And if there aren't any other questions, I just want to say thank you again to Nadia for hosting this and for giving us an overview of what the findings were for the IFES values assessment. For all those who want to access the values assessment, you can find it. I've put a link in the chat. But otherwise, thank you all for attending in person and online, and we'll see you next week. Bye.